On June 3rd, 2026, Kuwait's airport was attacked. As footage from the Kuwaiti government shows, one of the terminals was seriously damaged. Who attacked Kuwait? The attack came from Iran. Iran's the country who, not long ago, looked as if it was on the verge of regime change. That, however, no longer looks apparent. Iran's government has made a surprising comeback, preventing regime change and threatening markets from America to China. And this is how that happened. Welcome to the first episode of Iran, the War. Today we're discussing the Iranian home front. The first thing we need to understand about Iran is the government, what many people refer to as the regime. Iran's regime is a bit different from other regimes. When we think of regimes, we often think of personal regimes led by a single man, like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya or Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The regime in Iran, however, is a bit different, because Iran's regime has something called systems. Regardless of how democratic the country is, systems are systems, and systems are a marvelous thing. As Shane Parrish says in this book, having better judgment or making better decisions is about, quote, designing systems when you're at your best that work when you are at your worst. It basically means putting a plan for what you're gonna do when things get rough. And in the case of politics, it's also about what other people are gonna do when things get rough. And we can see that in this article by Narges Bajoghli and Vali Nasr. They say that Iran's universities, research institutions, think tanks, and government bodies hosted debates and considered the lessons from the June 2025 war.
عرض کردم ما خیلی تو اون یکی دو شب اول بد افتضاح عمل کردیم. ما متاسفانه بیدار نبودیم.
The result, they say, was a significant amount of institutional change. One possible example of these lessons learned is this paper, written at the Imam Sadegh University at Tehran. In the abstract, the paper recommends things like redefined regional diplomacy, supporting supply chains, and expanding industries. These recommendations were a result of the education system, and what ended up happening was that more systems were set in place. In June last year, for example, several sources reported that Iran's former leader, Ali Khamenei, had picked the replacements of several military commanders in case of their deaths, in addition, of course, to a successor for himself. This means that Iran's chain of command was prepared, potentially months in advance, for the mass assassinations that would take place. But arguably, there was something even more important than that truly affected the course of the war, and that is decentralization. Decentralization is basically a system in and of itself. It helps ensure that if the top commander gets taken out, then the bottom commanders will be able to act on their own. And that is what happened with Iran's armed forces. According to this article by The Economist, Iran's IRGC gave commanders more freedom to launch attacks on their own. This basically meant that when the war broke out and the top commanders were eliminated, lower level commanders were still able to fight on their own. This dynamic of decentralization happened outside of Iran's borders as well. When it began, the Iran war quickly spread to Iraq and Lebanon as well. Iran's allies in these two countries, notably the Shia militias in Iraq and Lebanon, launched their own respective attacks, adding to the Iranian war effort. As this article from the Wall Street Journal says, for example, over 1,000 drone strikes on Saudi Arabia originated not in Iran, but instead in Iraq. And that's without mentioning, of course, the other war going on between the Israelis and the group Hezbollah. The Lebanese front placed more pressure on the state of Israel. The next thing that changed was popular opinion. The Iranian people were an important part of this story from the very beginning. When US President Donald Trump announced the war, he called on Iranians
to take over your government. It will be yours to take.
The thing is though, it didn't work out like that. As Bajoghli and Nasr say in this same article, the Iranian people had a different experience. The Israeli and American bombings, quote, reverberated through their bodies night and day. BBC Farsi shares similar reports, including things like, quote, people no longer say they wish the government would go. They say they just want it to end. And quote, the situation is really scary. The result, Trump's calls for people to take over the government, just doesn't happen. In essence, it means that focus was shifted away from people hating the government to people disliking the Israeli and American bombardments. The next thing is the economy. Iran was one of the most sanctioned countries on earth before the war started, and that has not changed. As for the IRGC, however, this same article from The Economist also mentions that the IRGC generally relies on selling oil to China through shell companies, and also says that much of the IRGC's money is made through, quote, illicit imports and exports. All this means that Iran has been able to evade US sanctions for the most part, although the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz may complicate things. And finally, you have Iran's strategy. When the Israelis and the Americans attacked, Iran needed to respond in a way that would cause similar damage, and that is where the Gulf countries come in. Closing the Strait of Hormuz was a risk, but on a political level, by closing the strait, it made the Iran war a war of global energy. It essentially tied the fate of the world's economies to the fate of Iran. All of that, of course, made things much more complicated for America. Attacking America's Arab allies also exacerbated that situation. The goal may have been to make them pay the price for America's war, and thereby cause division in the US-Arab alliances. Iran's usage of drone warfare also played an important role in how the war went. The end result of all of this is that Iran, despite all the troubles that it and its people have gone through, remains surprisingly resilient. As this source says, Israeli security sources confirm that replacing the regime is probably unlikely. It also says, though, that how the war ends up is still, quote, up in the air. As for regime change, US intelligence, as reported by Reuters, agrees. There's a catch though. The war is technically not exactly over yet. How the Iranian government proceeds after the war is officially over will still matter. The government needs to build back genuine popularity, and given how much moral capital it has gained over the past 3 months, it may be possible. That was Iran's side of the story, but to understand this war, we need to look at the other side. That's why in the next episode, we'll go over the Israeli front of the Iran war. So until then, thank you for watching, and stay tuned.